G'day everybody, hello. I've been wanting to make this video for a long time and I never seem to find the right time or the occasion to do it. I'm riding a train back home and I think no time better like the present, as I say. I want to make uh, a video about the Falkland Malvinas Islands dispute in English, which I feel is absolutely paramount and important to produce, for the simple fact that the English language is what has always dominated the educative narrative that the world has had, and thus what everybody, if interested, will come to know about this dispute between Argentina and Britain. Now, let's start on the premise that before I get into some historical notions and details, which I'm pretty sure will be a surprise to people who have taken the least bit of interest in this dispute, I want to talk a little bit about communications, the importance of education and antagonism, and how antagonism and fighting, as opposed to diplomacy and friendship, create a very different informational context than differ greatly in the informational context that they create. So to make a quick example, when two friends or two family members or whoever fight, we know we're not to expect either one of them to objectively calm down and look at things from the other side and or make reference to some of the points that the other one is right about. When people fight, what they care about is winning. And it's a very primordial, very primitive force that kind of takes over, and it goes against what is truth, knowledge, and communications. It's human speech and our ability to build civilization through communication and education, language, is the bearer of truth when we're not fighting, because we're inquisitive. We want to know everything that there is to know. We want to ask questions and answer all questions. And so communication per se and education, written communication, is our vehicle by excellence of knowledge and truth. What happens is that when we fight, our intent is no longer that of being inquisitive, wanting to know and educate ourselves fairly and widely. What our priority becomes is simply winning that fight. And so often you see that when two people fight, there is no happy ending. There is a situation where the person refuses to acknowledge where they were wrong, refuses to say what really happened at the beginning, and all these sorts of facts, these sorts of problems that basically cause disputes and fights to taper out and disappear and be forgotten or pushed off to the side. What happens when you add to this the dominance of information? English is the dominating communicative force in the West. It is the most proliferous, most printed, most published language, and therefore is behind a lot of the books that kids are studying, even if it's studied in their own language, whether it be Africa, Asia, or Latin America. Even if it is by their own writers, a lot of their own learning and their own studies may have come from Europe, and a lot of what has come from Europe comes from English writers and all writers, but then eventually it makes it to the English printing presses, and every country, as they say in Spanish, everybody pushes water to their own bucket. So the fact that English dominates the printing presses of the world shares to some degrees, but overall it is always revising and reprinting. It means that if you were to be objective and look at every situation there is to look at, every conflict, every political complicated situation or conflict that is going on in the world, you will find that the narrative that pass through English a lot will tend to favor and will tend to make the English or the Americans or the British look a certain way more fairly, more like they've been trying to do something about it, but they weren't able to resolve a situation that really started with them as a problem. It always has. Now, in our overall sense of knowing what is right, we tend to include often as an attempt or as appearing as an intent to be fair and objective, narratives that would seem to be objective and fair or neutral, but in reality, we're going against nature when we are truly 100% absolutely neutral, objective, and fair, because there is a tendency always to not want to see ourselves as the doer of evil. One of the things that triggers people the most is when somebody eloquently and simply and calmly points out that you were the one at fault, that you were the one who started it. We go against evolution when we recognize that we would destroy or attack or go against any form of life or form of thriving in the world. Anyways, so this is sort of the premise on which I want to talk a little bit about the history of the conflict, in that we understand that all that has been disseminated, pretty much 90%, and including even the vocabulary and the language Argentinians themselves use towards understanding the conflict, is pretty much created and generated by the English language. And when it comes to a sovereignty dispute about territory, about political righteousness and what have you in history, you better believe that that is going to be felt very patriotically or very nationalistically, and more these primitive forces are going to come into play, than not wanting to recognize where we slipped, where we didn't do the correct thing, where we cheated, where we lied, where we were the ones to start the conflict, and so forth, will be more likely to not be included in that narrative, even when especially when attempting to be fair or objective, or appear that we're being objective or fair, precisely because it is something that concerns the history of our nation. And so I felt there was an immense need to create an English produced narrative of the conflict that is told not just from the Argentinian side, but from a truly globalist in the sense of all of human history, so the global perspective. In fact, one would say that perhaps it's only the case that one should present the Argentine narrative. Well, I have to say the Argentine narrative, the Argentine perspective is not very pure. It is dotted with facts that are omitted by the British narrative, that the historical account by the English steps over or tries to ignore, and yet it doesn't quite tell a whole integral story regarding the history of the islands in a way that really explains why they should have more right to the islands, for example, than the British or the islanders. There's nothing in the Argentine narrative that really eloquently explains. There are long segments. There are books that expand on broad areas of history that are true, that would explain why one could find in there why the Argentines have a right to the islands, or why their right might be greater or superior. But you always see a little bit of the conditioning that was produced. You detect conditioning that was produced by the English language narrative. So what I'm going to do, rather than get into what could be, for example, one better, more integral Argentine argument about the islands, I want to talk about the real history from the perspective of, let's say, anybody in the world who has no invested interest, who simply has been observing for 300 years this part of the world, and wants to tell a story about what happened there. And I think that is what we should all be looking at in every single conflict in the world. We should be looking at things not by who wants to win, who we want to believe is right, who we want to believe is wrong, but rather, like you would say, a fly on the wall who has been looking at this and can talk about everybody in equality of right to the world, equality of values and significance of everything that happened, of why they did everything they did, without being honed by the narratives that have warped our understanding of the world for the longest time since we've been educating ourselves on what to believe and what to think about things. We've been distributing and we've been lacing our narratives with somebody's preferred way of looking at it. So what I'm going to try to do is just point out a few things that history, especially the British narrative, will not include. And basically, I'm going to start with the first sightings of the islands. Now, are the first sightings important? Yes and no. Sightings are simply that. Sailing close by, landing on a beach, making a declaration, a written declaration. You know, if we were to take every single sighting declaration, first foot on the beach, that the Spanish, the Portuguese, the French did everywhere in the world, and defined the right to sovereignty by that, we would be in a constant, humongous brawl in the world, fighting over what belongs to who. And this said, it appears, it's almost certain that the British were not the first ones to actually sight the islands. If people want to have that answered, well, it is pretty factful to say it appears that the Portuguese, the lost expedition of Magellan, perhaps the Spanish, somebody got lost, they landed, they didn't name the islands. There is reference in universities, and I believe one of the universities in Seville in Spain, and perhaps in Holland, of accounts of Spanish sailors landing on, the same thing with Hawaii. Hawaii was not discovered by the British. There were already Europeans going to Hawaii. Cook wasn't the first one to sight the islands. And this is what I mean by, in 1555, there were 200 years earlier, there were missionaries going to the big island of Hawaii. So it is important that we understand that a language will try to serve itself. People, the British, have written books about Hawaii, about the Falkland, Malvinas Islands, and they have set the story that best, of course, presents their own case or makes themselves look more righteous or fair or whatever they feel. Some people believe in the virtue of being the boss, authoritarian, and other people believe we are going to show the world how to be fair and democratic. But it's always putting themselves in the best position in that context, in that premise, rather. Now, the British did sail through the islands, but it wasn't the British who first set foot and started colonizing these islands. They said, well, we found this, they're ours, like they said so many other islands may have been theirs. And the British felt it is important to document things, and they always believed in the systemizing of things, because that way, there's court, there's judicial aspects, there's title aspects, and so they really believed in putting everything down in paper and document. But that doesn't mean necessarily that the substance of sovereignty is found in that. People have a hard time understanding that. In fact, it was the French to first land and build a settlement and have people live there. I've never studied French history regarding the Malvinas. If there were French to be born on the islands or not. But the case is that they had a settlement, and a year later, the British decided also that it was a strategic place to have a fort. They didn't care to start a settlement. There wasn't anybody to colonize, so they could have started settling as a British territory, not a colonial territory. There was no need. to say this, but there was already a situation with Spain. The understanding at the time was Spain was the dominant power. Around this time is when Spain started sort of breaking down, and England started growing and taking, started attacking each other, what have you. But in this part of the world, there was still an understanding that the Spanish were strong. They had all the provinces and territories in Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, Chile, and they were traveling to the Philippines. They were going under. So the South Atlantic was kind of like their ball game, but the British decided to, in any case, they didn't recognize the papal Tordesillas declaration. The Pope said this is for Portugal and this is for Spain, and the Malvinas fell into Spanish. That was becoming outdated and obsolete because all these other empires were starting to sail and conquer the world. So they said, well, we'll just put a little fort there. The Spanish protested, went to the French, and they settled. The French said, okay, fine. You believe this is your area? We want some money for our efforts. And so the Spanish paid the French for the building of Port Louis, and the settlement was passed to the Spanish officially, economically, monetarily. Meanwhile, a year previous to this, the British had put a strategic little fort. Now keep in mind, the British had already attacked Argentina in the 1800s. They tried to take over Buenos Aires. They tried to take over Montevideo. They were trying to take over the Spanish provinces of the Rio de la Plata. They didn't succeed, and so instead, they put Port Egmont. Okay, I'm sorry. Wait, the Port Egmont was built in 17. Wait a second. 1768 or something like that. 67. Yeah, 65 and so forth. 64 were the French. 65 Port Egmont. Later came the attack on Argentina to try to take over the Spanish colony of Buenos Aires, which was its own province. It wasn't exactly a colony like the British ran the 13 colonies. The Spanish had a different system. They didn't call it colonial, they were expansionists. They wanted to spread culture, and they built universities, and they produced currency in South America. They saw it as an expansion of European culture. The British were more about making these places work for them and trading and taking it all back to London. And the Spanish too also, of course, took gold back to Spain. But the way they politically organized it was more autonomous. They were meant to, they weren't as ruled by Spain as the colonies were ruled by Britain. They had viceroyal, viceroys, and that would function like little kings in each province and what have you. So this is very contextual. It's very contextual because in 1771, or starting with in 1768, I believe, the Spanish protested and said, "What are you doing here? This is our part of the world. We already bought the French colony. You're not supposed to be here." The British refused to leave. Of course, they would claim that they had already, sailed through the islands or seen the islands and declared the islands theirs. But in the end, the Spanish showed up with a huge armada, and the British said it's not worth fighting for, and they left. They abandoned Port Egmont. So the dispute starts, one could say, on an even playing field between Spain and Britain, because Spain not necessarily saw it so much as a strategic military outpost from which to attack the British, for example. They saw it more as, in fact, as soon as the viceroyalty of uh, La Plata, Argentina, the viceroyalty of Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay was created, they assigned Malvinas to their administration. So Malvinas was already part of South America's Buenos Aires province and the viceroyalty of La Plata before that. So when people say, Argentina wanted to take the Falklands, well, no, the way the Argentinians saw it, it had never not been part of their administration. When Argentina started becoming a nation and the provinces started fighting the Spanish, consolidating, unifying in the United Provinces, Buenos Aires always had Malvinas attached to it. It wasn't developed, but it was there. It was part of their administrative body. So when 1820 came around, now, let me go back a little bit. The British didn't fight for the islands. They considered other things more important. This notion that there has to be effective occupation and settlement for sovereignty to start having any kind of significance, for right to the land, right to territory, to start having any kind of significance, was always understood, has always been understood to this day. And so the British kind of went off to the sidelines about this. And the Spanish started naming governors, assigned the islands to Buenos Aires, and so forth. So as far as the Argentinians were concerned, in their fair and equal perspective, as would Americans see the perspective of the birth of their own nation, they saw the islands as eventually getting, being dealt with, getting developed. In fact, this sentiment prevailed because in 1820 this sentiment was real, because otherwise David Jewett would not have in 1820 on an excursion to the Malvinas decide to declare the Malvinas part of the United Provinces of La Plata, of Argentina, in 1820. Why would he do that? They want to discredit him. They want to say it wasn't in this or that, whatever. But the reality is, why would he have done that if it would not have been a well-received and righteous act in the view of Buenos Aires? In any case, in 1771, the Spanish expelled the British without a fight. They kind of said, okay, we'll leave. There were protests by the British. And then there was some kind of agreement between the Spanish and the British where the Spanish said, okay, fine, we'll let you come back to Port Egmont as long as you stay on that island, because Port Egmont wasn't really even on the main island. It was on a smaller, Saunders Island, I believe. A big island right off the main western island. But the British said, I guess they were proud, I guess they had other things. They didn't honor that. They said, well, we don't want to, we're not interested, we're not going back. So they didn't. They came back for 2 or 3 years, I believe, and then they left it again. They didn't see it as a strategic thing. So this is what I'm saying from the beginning, the British have always looked at Malvinas as a strategic outpost. Even to this day, the British would like the islanders to feel like they're their own country and they want to take care of themselves and they don't need to be attached as a territory to Britain. But the islanders are not interested. The British are really pushing for that. Why? Because really that's what they wanted for. They wanted to have as a base, as an outpost from which to geopolitically project themselves. This has never been the case with the Spanish or the Argentinians. The Argentinians saw it as inheriting it from the administration of the viceroyalty. They, in fact, would have turned it into a province, very likely, had what followed later not happened. So 1820, the British were gone. They left Port Egmont. For 50 years, there was nobody on the islands, basically. Whalers and sealers, they would come. It was terra nullius. It didn't really belong to anybody. People would go there, sail it, fix their ships, what have you, but nobody really was actively administrating. Both the Spanish and the British had some kind of the Spanish considered it a part of the viceroyalty. of La Plata and would consistently consistently named governors. Well, the British had it. It was part of its military, basically. It's military like the American southern, the southern whatever. It's a military interest, and therefore administrated by their general or captain or whoever was part in charge of that sector of their military activities. So this is reinforced. This is clearly defined. The Spanish and the Argentinians had a civil, politically integrative attitude about the Malvinas, while the British always had a logistical, functional attitude about the islands. In 1820, David Hewitt raises the Argentine flag, declares it part of Argentina. And in 1825 or 1824, Luis Vernet's brother, before Luis Vernet sends a surveying expedition, and they look around and they do stuff and they see what's going on, so that his brother. So clearly, Buenos Aires was intent on developing these islands as their country was consolidating and taking shape. Vernet, in fact, eventually took a bunch of Creoles, Argentinians, and people from other countries and slaves to start a settlement. Now, of course, the British narrative wants to discredit Vernet, and in fact, Vernet apparently was playing both sides. Why? Because he was a man of the day, a worldly man who understood the British were very powerful, and they were very intent on becoming powerful and destroying or overcoming the Spanish Empire. The British wanted to basically take over. They wanted to have the Spanish Empire collapse, perhaps because they never forgave him about attacking Britain in Trafalgar, and they said, well, but this wasn't. The world wasn't a place of good people saying, well, what is fair? They were basically trying to yank things off each other. But in particular, the English were, because the Spanish really were not intent on well, now look at this, the English are growing, let's attack the 13 colonies. No, they had achieved a great deal before any of Europe had, and Britain wanted it, basically. The French weren't so keen about attacking the Spanish around the world. I mean, they were all kind of positioned against each other in China and Japan and South Asia, what have you. But really, the Spanish were trying to maintain it together. They weren't the antagonistic ones. While Britain saw an opportunity to seize an empire that had spread out too thin and was not, though now having enemies, it became evident that they had no way of defending themselves because they were spread out too thin, because they didn't have enough armies to defend this vast territory. The biggest empire that had ever existed so far was very unmilitaristic outside of the Spanish Peninsula. They did have military forces, of course, but it wasn't like this big, well-consolidated army that was existing in the world that militarily united the provinces with Spain and Europe. It was more like they had taken civilization to the Americas, they had taken religion, the church, and what have you. I took it out. But they weren't thinking in terms of also being as strong militarily. So, although Port Egmont was no longer on Malvinas, the English thought that it was a good chance to take advantage of this movement across the Americas of revolution and independence to instigate more antagonism towards Spain, and part of that was invading Buenos Aires. They didn't succeed, And then they started observing that, and 1827, Vernet had a thriving settlement on the islands that they had abandoned 50 years before, flying the Argentine flag. And at the same time, acting like we honor, telling the British he honored them, and reported to them or asked permission and things like that. So he was playing both sides of the field. Obviously, Buenos Aires was not, or were they? Because now this is what happened, and so far a lot of people probably already didn't know that politically the Malvinas Islands were part of Buenos Aires, and for all Argentinians that have ever existed, they never were not part of Buenos Aires, and that has to be clear. So they simply continued on and progressed on a natural political right they felt they had, which led to David Hewitt. Of course, Argentina was not the 13 colonies. They weren't super thriving with tons of industries and lots of people, and they really had to fight and struggle a great deal. They weren't strong at all. Although in principle, they tried to do what the rest of Europe was doing: create nation, create republic, create settlement, and so forth. Vernet clearly felt that to him the actual truth was that he was representing Argentina. And how do we know this? Even though he was trying to appease the British and saying, we're respecting your claims or what have you, because when the Americans and other sealers continued going to Malvinas, Vernet thought he needed to let them know, and there were declarations made, there were announcements printed saying that Argentina was now administrating the islands when nobody else was, really, in a settlement, administration of resources kind of way. So Argentina was bringing nationhood, was bringing settlement, was bringing sovereignty to the islands in the civil way, not in a way that was about using it as a military jumping board for something else, but as it was consolidating the Argentine territory. Very likely it would have become its own province eventually in a few years, as when the provinces started emerging. Patagonia was divided in 3 or 4 provinces. Malvinas probably would have been just another province. But Vernet had the brilliant idea of doing what he felt was right. One could be a fly on the wall and continue to investigate this even deeper, which is probably what we should all be doing, is looking for documents, seeing what the truth was, because Vernet had worked in the United States, and so one could say that he set up a situation for the Americans to attack, if you were a conspiracy theorist. But the case is that he decided he needed to make good on Argentinian law and regulation, and because the whalers refused to acknowledge these new resource exploitation laws, they refused to listen to him, and so he decided he needed to apply the law, and he sequestered some ships, and this didn't go well with the United States at all. Now, here start arguments that are very interesting, but nobody is talking about, because nobody's really talking about the whole span of truthful facts, one next to each other, that actually occurred in history. because all of this is silenced or not included, for example, in the narratives of the English language, we don't have, for example, arguments that would speak about, well, why didn't the United States want to recognize? Why didn't the United States say, you guys went too far? Because what happened? The United States sent a ship. The government, Washington did. This is not something that, buccaneers did on their own, privateers, I mean. They sent a ship with Captain Silas Duncan to basically destroy and pillage Puerto Luis, the Argentine settlement. And remove the occupants. Now, he didn't declare, this is British territory and we're recuperating it for the British. No, he acknowledged there was an Argentinian colony, and he then said, Silas Duncan did, he then said, again, this is no man's land. So the United States, what the United States was interested in was in there not being any rule of law. There not being anybody there to say, you can't do that. This now is our jurisdiction. Now, people can argue that there was a prejudice against the Spanish and that they had contempt for the creation of Argentina. And so they didn't have any respect for newly emerging laws that would define their territory according to their own reality, the existence of the viceroyalty, the borders and the frontiers and the administrative extensions of the viceroyalty of La Plata. Why didn't they recognize that? Why, if they are anti-monarchists, anti-empire, and they believe in the creation of independent republics, why did they not honor Argentina and what they claim? Because the Argentinians were trying to dot their T's and, dot their I's. Yeah, perhaps they were dotting their T's and striking their I's, I don't know. But they were trying in any case. They weren't trying to grab anything from anybody. They actually made these declarations. But the problem is that they were so small and there was so little mass behind the reality of the country in those days that maybe, they, instead of, calling for a United Nations gathering and declaring we are now administrating the Malvinas, they had it printed in the New York something, in the Times, and some bulletin was produced, but they weren't trying to hide it. They felt righteously sincere or virtuously sincere, and actually you can't argue against them. You can't say that then why should you feel they belong to you when they weren't part of your viceroyalty, they weren't part of Buenos Aires, they were. So they were earnest, and rightfully so, in their advancement towards Malvinas. And this is what today's English doesn't want to sound like. They want to make it sound like they're just trying to grab the islands, and now they're trying to they don't care about the islander rights, and and all this stuff. Well, we'll get there. So Silas Duncan got sent down there. Vernet had already left. I'm not a super scholar on this, but I feel it's important to restructure the narrative, and then maybe go in there with all the details that describe why things were the way they were after the incident where Vernet sequestered the ships, the whalers, the American whalers. Apparently, for some reason, some people also started leaving, or Vernet went back, and when he left, I guess he took some people with him, I don't know. But when Silas Duncan came back, Vernet wasn't any longer there. Maybe he knew what was going to happen. But nonetheless, Silas Duncan, made sure that it was unusable. He cannon blasted, some warehouses where they stored stuff, and I don't know, let the horses loose. I don't know what they did, but um, and took all the people that were there and removed them and took them over to, I don't know, Montevideo, I think. Maybe some to Brazil as well. I don't know. But the point is that it was the United States, actually. If we were to talk about the conflict, like I said, like an alien fly on the wall that looks at history and looks at what people do with their world, we would say, oh, it was the United States that started. They were the first ones to not let the Argentinians, advance in the settlement of their territory. They were the first ones to attack. In fact, the first country to attack Argentina as a nation was the United States, a little known fact. Because when the British tried to take over Buenos Aires, they weren't consolidated yet. They hadn't had their Philadelphia movement in 1810. They hadn't declared their independence yet. The British were trying to take the Spanish viceroyalty that was Buenos Aires. But Silas Duncan attacked Puerto Luis and called it an Argentine colony and ruptured relations with Argentina for 11 years because of this. The two countries, Argentina got upset at Silas Duncan's attack and they didn't talk to each other. I don't know if you could say that things were so sophisticated then as to call it a diplomatic rupture, but that's what it was. So Mr. Stanley lies. Maybe he doesn't know. I'm going to bet that he actually doesn't know the real history of the islands. When he celebrates 200 years of uninterrupted history between Argentina. No, that's not true, because by 1844, 20 years after today, more or less, the Argentinians and the Americans weren't talking because of Silas Duncan's attack. Silas Duncan immediately informs the British, we got rid of the Argentinians. Again, here's something interesting. What was the purpose of that? There may have been an official protocol of some sort. They were aware that the English were saying the islands belonged to them. So maybe after having won their war of independence, the Americans were quick to establish good relationships, and this was sort of a little gift, perhaps. It's some kind of diplomatic gift. Because one of the big differences between England and the American colonies and Spain and its great, vast Spanish provinces is that scorn didn't linger. There wasn't a disassociation. There wasn't like intense antagonism. There's always an understanding that we're the same people. They speak English, we speak English, we are British, we come from the British. That natural understanding never lost footing, notwithstanding whatever, anti-British, whatever, always present. The brotherhood of the Anglo Brotherhood has always been pretty healthy. Soon after the end of the War of Independence, with the Spanish provinces, it was exactly the opposite. Not only was there a disassociation because of the wars of independence, but because the British made a point of intervening in the various Spanish provinces everywhere, Caribbean, northern South America, western South America, South America, Brazil, they just wanted to control, they wanted to have all that, be able to make money out of all those territories that now they had chopped the head off. The people, the culture, the societies in Hispanic countries started very acceptingly looking at Europe, mainly Britain and France, as the ones that by default need to be our friends, because we just fought the Spanish, and so instead we're going to be with the British and the French. And so now, from a human point of view, if you understand people, that may be very, very positive, very optimistic from good, as a good intent from anybody, from a country or from a person. But the same natural truth, in the same natural plane, if you are on the other side of that relationship, what is the likelihood that you're going to say, and we want you to be a completely autonomous, independent nation? You already have the 8 of gold. The 8 of gold, we don't want to mess with it. You should continue producing it. It's your backbone, you know? No, of course not. We can only hope that we're loved. It's much more difficult to make sure that the person is loved. To make it simple. And so, well, what I was referring to is that before the independences, Spain produced the first global currency in Peru and Bolivia, I think, mainly. And it was used in China and Japan. And so, you know, the Spanish Empire was the first truly, and positive. This is the most important thing. You know, they weren't about putting Indians in concentration camps, and you know, you see it today. They're all mixed. Why are Spanish populations so mulatto, so mixed? You got to realize that the spirit, the political spirit, the understanding of expansionism was one that had more to do with sharing, exporting, expanding what we feel is greater because it's God, it's Christianity, it's education, and what have you. But the Queen of Spain, Queen Elizabeth, for example, decreed that the Indians were equal in all ways as Europeans, and they had a right to come to Europe and be citizens of Europe. And the British didn't do this with the American natives. So that tells you there is a huge difference, which you see the echoes of to this day, between how the British went about expansionism and how the Spanish went about expansionism. So when Silas Duncan left, the islands again destroyed, uninhabited, the Argentinians nonetheless, you know, got back on their knees and tried to send somebody that would go there, because it was very hard. I mean, very hard trying to settle the islands. There was nothing there. No trees grew there. So they did, and it didn't go wonderful. You know, there were, you know, it's kind of like the far west. You know, people were cutting each other's throats and stuff. But they were trying. And shortly afterwards, not that much, or I think somebody was left there after Silas Duncan left. I don't know, I forget the details now. But the British heeded the Americans turning them on to what had happened, and sent Onslow there to, you know, raise the British flag and say, these are ours now. Why did the British do it is the question, the central question here. Why didn't they send somebody as soon as they saw during the 1820s, starting with 1820, 1824, 25, Vernet's arrival in 1827, they saw that the Argentinians were starting to treat this territory as how they felt it was, theirs. They were going to establish sovereignty. If they really felt these are ours, that was the moment to do it, before the settlement became successful, before another Vernet or two Vernets or three Vernets. Louis Vernet was the Hungarian-Argentinian settler. His name went there. Instead, they went when they knew that the Argentinians could not get back on their feet, that the Americans had destroyed the settlement. And in fact, they went back to the Spanish settlement. You see, Port Egmont was on the western island, on Saunders Island, like I said at the beginning. They had actually never set foot on the eastern island, where Stanley is today. The Spanish, French, and Argentinian settlement were north of Stanley, a few kilometers, in a smaller bay. And that's where the British went to expel the Argentinians. They didn't go back to Port Egmont. They didn't want to honor any kind of righteous gentleman's agreement between Spain and Britain or anything like that. They wanted to make sure Argentina didn't get the islands, basically. And that's how the conflict starts. It is premised, first of all, on the Americans starting the conflict. Second of all, on the British making sure that the Argentinians didn't get there. Because maybe the British eventually, if the Argentinians had never gone there and said, yeah, well, who cares? We don't really want them. They're there. The British eventually may have said, well, and those islands too, we saw them in 1690, 17, whatever. Yeah, sure. But when we're talking about sovereign right to territory, the substance of sovereign right to territory, which is not that complex of a notion. It's written in many ways, in many forms. You can look it up. Effective occupation, da-da-da. It matters if there were people there, if people are colonized, or if nobody was there before, and these sort of notions. But overall, and the most naturally well-founded, righteously substantiated understanding of sovereignty, of right to a land, is when you establish integral right, meaning this is our home and these are the borders around us. Not when you're an extension or a colony for another country or an overseas territory, but when you say, we're now living there, this is our home now. And you have what every other country has. Embassies from all other countries, every single thing that human civilization produces, you find a way of producing it yourselves with your own hands, or finding ways to buy it if with money that you generate from your own productions, from your own industries, and you grow like every other nation grew on the effective settlement of its people, from the smallest to the biggest nation. And that's what endows you to say, well, you flew a flag, you sail your boat through here, whatever, but we are the ones that are actually now as one relating to the rest of the world's countries. And that's where the flame of sovereignty actually grows and is substantiated and founded. So the Argentinians started doing that. The Argentinians started treating the islands like a part of Buenos Aires, which was becoming Argentina. It wasn't Argentina and that other territory it wants to have. Now, if you read the British narrative, they will try this and they will try that to break apart these more noble and more integral understandings of history. They will say that all the Argentinians are also trying to colonize the Malvinas. No, they weren't trying to colonize the Malvinas. That's a lie. The Malvinas already came with Buenos Aires. They were part of the Buenos Aires province before it became Argentina. So one of the worst ills of this, the narrative of this dispute, is the immense void, the immense lack of truths. It is completely populated by the narrative of a language that wants to have the islands and wants to take the islands from Argentina, still to this day. Because as long as the islands are an overseas territory, and no matter how autonomous and self-represented, and we choose this and we choose that, the islanders may, of course, that's what they need to say to try to go against everything I just explained. And so Britain knows that, and that's why it dresses up the protocols and the workings and the labels of its overseas territories to make it, as long as it leaves itself as the crown in the middle, it makes it appear, and so you can apply like the right to self-determination. The right to self-determination is grounded on natural sovereignty. Now, you can't give somebody the right to self-determination. We are all born with the right to self-determination. And as we get together as a group, we make a society, a country, a people, we acquire self-determination as the virtue of the integral nation or country, a territory that we create as a people. You can't say, well, we have self-determination because Britain says we have self-determination. That's not how it works. It's not well-founded. It's not truly substantiated. Because ultimately, if China puts a nuclear missile in Argentina, aimed not at the Falklands, but aimed at Britain, Britain will not really care to ask the Falklanders, and there may be a show of, we ask permission, can we bring our deterrent missiles to the islands? And the islanders will say yes and yes. If the islanders said no, do you think Britain is not going to take that deterrent missile to the Falklands? Of course it will. And so sovereignty does not exist really for the islanders, because ultimately, if it's not good cop, it's bad cop, but it will be done. Because that's what they're for. That's what they are a British territory overseas for. So this sort of paradigm of calling freedom something that is not totally free, autonomous something that is dependent, is the modus operandi by which this conflict has been moved forward and understood. It's a system. It's like a mechanical system, a way of having a serpent with two heads. And so we can say, well, now the islanders have a right to be here, and it's their self-determination, and and the whole United Nations has to say, yep, that sounds right. That sounds righteous. So we came up with that, didn't we, But if you analyze its virtuous, properly grounded, natural morality, it doesn't stand. If you take it all the way to the root, it doesn't stand. So, in 1946, after the end of Second World War, the Europeans wanted to look good to the world. We're doing something. We won because we are the better ones, the more righteous ones. We're the ones that want peace and blah 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 blah. And the whole thing only lasted. They managed to keep it going. Keep that spiel going for about 50 years. Well, not really. As soon as they started attacking Vietnam, and that all flew out the window. But let's just say until recently, created the decolonization list of non-self-governing territories sector in the United Nations for the purpose of resolving conflicts, making right what is wrong, facilitating things so that there would be a mechanism through which there would be no more conflict or war or disputes. But Timor could say, well, now that we recognize that we're occupying their Macau, islands in the Caribbean, different places where imperial countries had gone and occupied land that was established, countries, societies, cultures, ancient cultures in many cases that had been established. and rightfully were protesting and warring and hating the Europeans and what have you. So in the United Nations, this instrument was created. Was the Falklands, Malvinas, a colony? Had it been colonized? Because the British will deny that they took him from Argentina, right? They will say, no, we didn't take him from Argentina. There was nobody there. Oh, okay. So what kind of colony is it exactly? Because there's no people protesting. It's time for you to go. Well, you could say it's kind of like the naturist kind of like colonizing Mars, right? Where there was nobody there. And so we're expanding humanity, that kind of colony. Oh, but that's not what the United Nations intends through its instrument of decolonization. The instrument of the United Nations is for the purposes of resolving disgruntled populations, for liberating older countries that were unlawfully, unrightfully occupied and ruled by more powerful empires. That's not the case with Malvinas. But nonetheless, Britain was smart enough to say, let's include Malvinas in the list of non-self-governing colonies. Huh. Nobody asked for it on Malvinas. Perhaps the Argentinians thought it was fair because, well, it seems like they're listening to us, like they want to resolve something. But the British never said colonized on the premise of liberating the islands for Argentina or for the Argentinians. No. The Argentinians wanted to believe that. And here some of them want to go with that narrative. And this is what I mean when I said in the beginning that even the Argentine narrative is sort of degradantly constructed. It's kind of borrowing from here and there and true parts of history, but at the same time, it honors the United Nations. The United Nations intent to deal with the Malvinas Islands issue, Falkland Islands issue. But in reality, the United Nations, in its dealing with Falkland Malvinas dispute, is actually helping and assisting Britain. And that is what England wanted. England very smartly said, well, let's put it in that mechanism because nobody's ever gonna, of the colonized territory, will ever demand that we let go of them. We keep them happy and supplied, and they're British. We speak the same language. We are all their history, practically. They have a little bit of history on the islands, but really they're just people that came from here, and they've never asked to be independent. And so it works out beautifully. Because to the world, the British can stand up and say, we're honoring this. We're looking at it as the right to self-determination by the peoples of the world. And everybody stands up and applauds. But the real reason Britain put the islands in the list of non-self-governing territories is because it worked in their favor. Not for the purpose of freeing the islands, but so that they could keep the islands. So to this day, Britain continues taking the islands from Argentina, which is what I always say. Everything that they do, the War of 82. This is another one. This is just amazing. It's really a fascinating conflict in the world because of how when you turn the pages, it just opens up a whole encyclopedia of things that people try to hide and not talk about, and new ways that help you understand resolving other situations in the world and what is really going on in a lot of places that people don't talk about. It's just wonderful when you start looking at this conflict really for what it is. we do talk about, and it has been said, that the military junta in 1982 were desperate because the people were kicking them out. They got tired of them massacring their own people, and they wanted them out. The military junta in Argentina was supported by America because, and Britain, because they were fighting the communists in their Cold War, global global-wide interventionism. They even trained the military in how to torture people, and so they were okay with it. But so what did Galtieri think? Yeah, we're pleasing them. We're keeping communism out of Argentina. We're Britain won't do anything about it, and they can't act on it. And if we show a little bit of resolve, we'll push them to negotiations. So they did one of the stupidest things any military has ever done in face of the world's fourth strongest power, or what have you. At the time, they want to say that they're weak. Sure. Okay, yeah, whatever. At the time. And thinking that then the British would come to the negotiation table. But they got haughty, they got arrogant. They thought, because they thought they had scored big with the Argentinians. The Argentinians, who didn't see this as something that the military had achieved in the world, but rather that they were being useful for something they had always claimed and denounced injustice about, and now they got involved and they acted militarily, went out and celebrated, not because they wanted to attack the Malvinas, which again is something that the English language narratives will try to make it sound like that we're celebrating on the streets, because now they're big and angry and mean and they take over people's lands, right? This is what happens in the world. People are fighting over blame, over others believing that you're the bad guy. Really, who's talking about the truth? Would we be this objective about the whole world? I don't know what would happen. Some people would start getting really desperate. Now, it seems odd when you think about it, because even though the generals, were foolish and what have you, and presumptuous and arrogant, and one of them drank a lot, it appears. Really? I mean, you're going to position yourself against NATO? Because he's a military man. He knows that Europe was in agreement, a military agreement, very, very binding, very, very integral, very, very functioning and functional military alliance since World War II. And regardless of whether one or the other country would not like what Britain did or not want to participate, ultimately, he had to know it comes down to, push comes to shove, they have no option but to support, if push comes to shove, the British. Whether we're talking about Greece and Italy and Spain, that were the countries that had some heart about the situation, and say, wait a second, this sounds ridiculous. Argentina is populated by Europeans. We're all the West. What are you talking about? There's something funny. There's something fishy when you think about it. And it is revealed by key factors. One is that you would think that there actually being a dispute since 1880, where even the United States was part of and is well aware of it being a dispute between Britain and Argentina. Nonetheless, there was no real initiative or intent on resolving the dispute, the conflict. In fact, it was in Britain's interest to treat the what it called first a crisis, indeed, as an attack on British sovereignty. So here we go, using the semantics to try to foster allegiance and beliefs in your listener, which is what happens every day, unfortunately. What the news and all medias of communication are responsible for, creating hatred by disseminating narratives that people are interested in others believing. Instead of telling the story from an objective, alien fly on the wall, which is what we should all be doing about the world and about every country's situation with another country. So, signs, you start seeing the Peruvians wanted to propose something, ceasefire, and then, the Argentinians they thought they could play hardball, the junta, the military, the dictators. They felt, we're going to act tough. We're not going to go back and leave the islands because the British are just going to advance. And that is not stupid because it happens every single day. In fact, the British, people should go and research what happened in those days, who offered what. There were many proposals, but it was never the British that demonstrated a desire and an intent. This is what matters. This is the key point. Others did try to propose a solution. People did know that it was an existing conflict between Argentina and Britain. But it was never the British themselves that wanted to find a resolution to the dispute. The Argentinians didn't either, because the way the Argentinians saw it, they have history. Proportionately, the Argentinians, through all these years, knew about the Malvinas having been taken by the British from them in 1833. In contrast, in 1982, most British people didn't know where the Falklands were. This was of London's interest, of military interest, of a functional, expansionist, political, closed-circuit, few people knowledge. It had become a cultural thing like it later became after the war. And the war indeed was very useful to bring the nationalistic idea of a territory that should belong to Britain onto the British population. And I'm saying this because there are a lot of things that seem to indicate this war was really favorable to Britain. Like it already had it all mapped out almost. There was never a single push, a single cry for saying, wait a sec, we don't want to be enemies with the Argentinians. We don't want to create this problem in the West. We want to resolve and make something positive, work together. Let's plan on something. Let's negotiate on eventual independence of the islands. Somehow the Argentinians believed they should just belong to them. They felt that they were inherited territory from Spain. But if it had been the intent, there could have been a way to say, well, fine, you administrate them, or we'll conjointly administrate for 100 years, and let's give them a vote in 100 years, and see what they want to do, or something, anything, to try to not bring about a war, to try to avoid killing soldiers, to try to avoid the economic destruction of one country more than another that war brings. Unless, of course, it was in the interest of one of those two countries to harm more the weaker country. So there are several reasons one could say, well, you know what, the British wanted this. Did America, NATO, Britain have intelligence that had been studying the trips of the generals to Europe and the things that they were saying and the things that they were doing the previous year to where they could conclude, or where intelligence could conclude, they were these crazy forces are going to try to take back the islands by force, and they probably think that if they show it that way, we'll be forced to negotiate. It looks like they're going to do this. We see why they think they can get away with this. And do you think that intelligence did not exist? Of course it did. Of course it did. Of course the Americans behind our primetime news networks with the British were talking about this. What are we going to do if this happens? Somewhere at some level. So the question is, was it convenient to let them go ahead? The question is left to ponder on whether the British Americans knew that they were going to attack, and let's make sure that it happens. This is going to work out cherry for us. Because of course we're going to beat them in little time. Of course we have all the controls. We'll stop everything from getting to them. We'll turn all the we'll close all the faucets. This is not an what if at all. This is when. How long will it take us how long will it take for us to get them to surrender is basically all the whole thing was leading towards. And so that question is left there. Let's say we haven't answered it yet. We don't know for sure. It's not easy to bury, it's not hard at all to bury information that regards South American countries and European countries in the United States. It's not easy at all to not have information and to bury it, to have it never exist. There's hardly anything is known about the real history of South America, the real history of countries in relation to Britain, how much what Britain did to the development of these new countries becoming independent in South America, Britain and the United States, how they affected their beginnings, how they affected them socially at the start of the 1800s, how they started off, what Britain actually did to their economies, what England actually did to their economies, to their political structures, to their politicians even. All this is not known at all by anybody who speaks English. It's like a huge, enormous, dark area where there are no light bulbs on. We know this history about, nice little fairy tale Disney history about the Spanish Empire and the countries became free and blah, blah, blah. And oh, look, they must be really bad at doing things, because look at what a hard time they're having, and that's all we know. Why they're actually having a hard time is nobody knows. Nobody has been educated on the actual history of South America and Latin America. So the war continues, goes as it did, and as it was predicted it would go. Not how many would may have wanted to believe it went in Argentina, but it did end up the way the British and the Americans knew it was going to end. What happened afterwards? That's what we got to look at. Let's look at the relationship afterwards. Immediately, the British proceed to a kind of economic agreement that people have compared to the Versailles Agreement, where they tried to tie down Germany like it was Gulliver, so that it couldn't move, it couldn't be big again, it couldn't stand up. And that's why after the First World War, and that's why Hitler came to power. That's too big of a story to have erased it. And yet nobody talks about that, of course, because the English language dominates all our education and all our communication. So what we hear about is what sounds good to the English ear, to the American ear. We're not going... What doesn't sound good to the English or American ear will not thrive in the world of education and communications, the world over. Unless a country intends to, specifically work on that in their own language and prints and disseminates literature. Well, they did something like that with the Argentinians. They created a treaty where Argentina could only have economic relations with Britain, a bunch of things, that are there, which people play down. I don't know why they don't look more into that. They don't get more angry about that. problem is that Argentina had no government. After the war, of course, there was no respect. There was, the war has a psychological effect on the sociology of a country. This is enormous, and it's a big subject that I don't want to get into right now. What I'm more interested in is in the facts that the English language will not tell you about. If you look at the social network fights, arguments, narratives, defense rhetoric that comes from the islanders and the British or the English language, what you hear are things that are meant to make Argentina the bad guy, that is irrational. The almost 200-year-old dispute does not exist. It's played down. The base is there in case of an Argentinian attack. Okay, look. This is hilarious. Not only do the Argentinians have zero fervor in their literature, culture, media, way of thinking about using military force and we're going to capture the Malvinas, and if anything, it has been seeded by the attitude coming from the other side, like a new phenomena that you would never hear an Argentinian talk that way. But they'll say that the base, a military base of about, I think it's 2,000 troops or something, is there in defense of the islands. From who? Well, the only ones they could possibly say are the Argentinians, because they're out in the middle of nowhere. The closest countries are South Africa, Brazil, Antarctica. Threat from who? Well, the Argentinians. That's how we have to justify all the money that is spent on that base. So, in other words, it is required to have a military hypothesis, a war hypothesis, for Britain to be able to expand and keep a base on the Malvinas that are not being threatened by Argentina. When Argentinians have written in the Constitution that they're not giving up their claim, their protest, but they will only pursue peaceful means and diplomatic means in their Constitution. But none of that matters, because if you start talking that way, you start saying, well, why are we spending all that money? Why are we keeping... The war was extremely useful. And it makes you wonder if it was not really ultimately intended or really, really accepted, like very positively accepted and wanted by the British. Because everything indicates a structure, a system, of way of proceeding after the war that required a war, and not an explanation of history as it really was, for example. It is important to have monuments. I mean, the Falklands, in the case, looking at it from the British point of view, have very, very, very little history, cultural history. It's only less than 3,000 people, I think. I don't know if you count the military. I don't know if it's 5, or if you count the military, it's only 1,800 or something like that. But their history actually consists of Argentinians that were gauchos, that they brought a lot of Spanish words, and it's all systematically getting erased. The situation with why is it so important for Britain to keep throwing coal in that furnace of hostility and war, and continue to speak of Argentinians as antagonistic, denying their aspects of peacefulness, or that not in their nature to war, that Argentinians never sought war. And it's really interesting. This was just something the military pulled out of their sleeve for their own reasons. The Argentinians never once in all their history had a rhetoric of, we're going to take back the Malvinas or anything like that. No. Well, they just accepted, the islanders were there, and, it was completely a peaceful situation. It would have been in the interest of the British to, instead of proliferate a narrative of antagonism, Argentinians mean, they don't care about our rights, we don't exist, we're not people, and all this stuff that they say. They don't see us as people, we're whatever, squatters. Everything gets twisted to try to make it sound effectively an insult, so you can always keep throwing that coal in that furnace of hate. Would have been in the British best interest to immediately after the war, given that certainly after Argentina had used all the missiles it had, the people hated the military, all the soldiers were completely demoralized and what have you. It was not about to stand up again and attack the islands. There was no need to have a military base immediately afterwards. And yet they wasted no time. They wasted no time, even though there wasn't a situation that warranted, there was no situation whatsoever at all, in the least bit, that warranted military defense of the islands after the War of '82 was over. Because not only because Argentina was exhausted in every single way, there was no military left. People hated the police. People hated the military. It was the antithesis, however say it, the antonym of a danger. Argentina was the antonym of a danger to the islands following the war. Yet the British wasted no time in creating a huge military base. I mean, you look at it from the air and it looks like, I don't know, Guantanamo is a barrack compared to it. It's this huge thing, like a big NATO base in the South Atlantic. And again, you wonder, that's odd. It makes you wonder, the only thing that could justify that huge military base, as many people as there is a population in it, is having a war. And people that continue to say, yeah, they hate us, they don't want us, they want to rob our land, and we're real, we exist, we're not squatters. They need all that and the war in order to keep fueling. So, I mean, it's no secret that Britain, the United States, and some other countries are militaristic countries. What is a militaristic country? An invasive, militaristic, expansionist country. It's what the word says, but the characteristic of a military is like a scully. You instigate something that will make somebody be upset, or you capitalize on an internal fight, or you work through the language of hostility. You fuel antagonism so that then you have a reason that justifies picking up arms, convincing your own people to fight. Like the Spartans, you think war in order to expand, in order to conquer, in order to invade. And that's what the Malvinas is, as we experience it. In reality, it's a very interesting situation. It's a very interesting situation of human civilization. Because another thing that substantiates the need for a war is the following. What was happening in the 1970s is that gradually, and the Argentinians could have done a lot better, could have been a lot better about it, in 100 different ways, which shows you there was a natural sort of gravitational force. Something that nobody can do anything about. And it's governed by the fact that the islands are far south enough and caught by the storm system of the South Atlantic to where it's very hard to farm, very, very hard. In fact, there are no native trees that grow like in the Aleutian Islands where trees can't grow because the wind won't allow something to stand up. It's hard to keep horses and cattle. It's hard to settle. It's a very hard place to colonize in a natural way, and establish a settlement. Now, you can, obviously, we can, human beings now can. But even though we can forge our stones and our steel onto places that are on the other side of the fence of naturally conducive to settlement, but actually antagonistic towards settlement instead. Even though, because we're human beings, organic, naturally feeling, naturally connected to the earth, we tend to sooner or later want to gravitate to where others are, to where countries that have more to do are, if they're close by, if they have universities, if they're well established countries with institutions and things. And also to start getting the things that we want, to start being, to get wood so that we can build here, eat the food that we do want. And of course, there is no other country closer to Malvinas than Argentina. Basically, when you look out into the ocean, you don't see anything. Everything is far, far away, but you look in one direction and you know that Argentina is your closest landmass. And so naturally, the islands, the people of the islands would gravitate to relating to Argentina, but not just relating, to eventually incorporating itself into Argentina. Because even if, let's say, they had a great relationship. Let's say they had a great relationship. There was never any dispute. And, they got resources and stuff from Argentina back and forth, traveling, da 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 da. Still, at some point, and especially if Argentina had been a stable country, at some point you can say, well, we're just, we have dual citizenship. We go there every year. Half our family is born there, and half of them come live over here, and half of them, half our population are made of people that came from there, and then we go live over there. And at some point, it naturally consolidates, which is why a lot of people intuitively feel the islands are Argentinian. They should be Argentinian. They don't know why. They can't explain it, but there is actually natural forces at work. And what I feel is that in the 70s, Argentina built a runway and started exporting natural gas, and things were good. Britain was talking secretly. They didn't want to make a big deal about it for various reasons. But they were talking about how to resolve the dispute, do a lease back. So there is acknowledgement of a dispute, of a conflict, of a territorial. And a territorial conflict, a territorial dispute, can only exist and can only be real if there was one party that abused its force and took something from another party. That's how disputes occur everywhere in the world throughout history. One person had more power, had more means, and was able to move forward onto something that somebody else said, wait a second, no, that's mine. That shouldn't be the case. And so conflicts arises. So again, today the English narrative also edits that whole part that was, they try to be subtle about it, but we all know about it. Even up to Thatcher. Even Thatcher was talking to some generals or something about how are we going to deal with this. Yeah, the Argentinians blew it in some way. It wasn't the Argentinians, it was the military junta.
And again, there's also talk about people tricking some Argentinian ship recycler uh, was given some contract to go do something in South Georgia, which the Argentines also claim. I want to expand onto that also, but I don't know if I didn't have enough time. But and he then raised the Argentinian flag because the Argentinians always felt this is just how we know this chapter of history. These islands were taken. Now, Georgia, Sandwich Islands in South Georgia are considered, are claimed by the Argentinians also. I personally make a distinction. I personally feel that Malvinas was clearly becoming part of Argentina as it was consolidating, when the British were not showing any interest in resolving an existing dispute or in doing anything about settling at least their half of the islands. Because while the Argentinians were going to Puerto Soledad, the eastern island, and changed the name from Puerto Soledad to Puerto Luis, and Verney was there and all that before attacked by the Americans or after, the British could have said, look, the Argentinians are, let's make sure that we get what's ours, and sent people to establish Fort Egmont again, or a settlement on the western island across the waters from Saunders Island. But they didn't do that. They didn't. Why? Because they always knew. They always knew that Argentina would never be able to fend them off, defend themselves against an intent British takeover of the islands. Knowing that, having that under their belt, characterizes this dispute as well. Again, the conflict, the dispute seems to always be rooted in the British taking the islands from the Argentinians. Because, from the British point of view, maybe they may or may not have so much right, 50% right to the islands, 30% right, 60% right to the island, what have you. There was never an intent to resolve the dispute. They had never been to the eastern island. If you look at a map, which is very interesting because the islands themselves, I find this very interesting. The islands themselves are in the shape of a division sign or a percentage, a slanted incline. And so it is very clear that if two countries are disputing, truly and truly honoring sort of as equals that fight against each other, like most situations are, that do we really want to war them? We could beat them, but they're also tough. They could hurt us badly, and every other conflict in the world has usually resulted in a division of islands or a division of a peninsula or a division of land. Not here. The British could have gone back to Port Egmont and taken over the western island. They wanted to have a base, facing Argentina, and let the Argentinians make good on their Spanish inheritance. But they didn't want that. They wanted to take the whole thing. And they wanted to take the whole thing because they knew they could. They knew they could easily pull the wool over the Argentinians, who have always been needy and dependent of European money, assistance, weapons, what have you, whatever, and capitalize on that need to trick or fool somebody, leading to taking something from them when they won't be able to defend and take it back. So the notion of bullying and robbing, even continuing to take from the weaker, is completely rooted in defining the truth, the objective truth of understanding this conflict between Argentina and Britain, which is really sad. I mean, nothing new. I mean, we see bullying situations, but now we're becoming brazenly, bodaciously arrogant about declaring our injustices in the news media. We're gonna go to Venezuela and take their oil. It's crazy. The world has gotten to a point where it's absolutely absurd, insanity. But at least talk about it the way it really is. Don't, on top of the fact that you have enough force to take the islands from Argentina anytime you want. You don't need to resort to making them the bad guy of the story just because you want to look better. And at the same time, you're saying we don't care if the Israelis kill 10,000 children tomorrow, but we want to look better. I mean, the insanity that is describing the world these days is ridiculous. The same voice will say, we want to look like we're righteous, like they're the ones at fault. And God knows they try. If they could put a little grenade in the hand of a Palestinian baby to make him look like a terrorist, they would. It's just crazy. But if we could be objective about it, we would say that the Argentinians and the British are faced in a real, very much real, old territorial dispute about right to a land, to a group of islands, that the British did not give sovereignty to those islands, but they brought their own people to secure them for them. They put British people on the islands, they hosted, they encouraged, they subsidized, they help, they celebrate, whatever word you want to use, whatever description. It is so that they can secure the islands for themselves, not because they wanted to give a home to whoever wanted to have their own nation, because they could have done that. They don't need the islanders' permission for that. What they do is they make a referendum that says, do the islanders accept that we rule and administrate their islands? Of course, they only did that after, again, another reason for the war. See, these reasons keep coming up. And the more you think about it honestly and sincerely, the more you start saying, wait a second, this war really came in handy, didn't it? Because they were able to produce immediately a referendum where 99% of the people voted in favor. Not only that, but if you study the social cultural situation of the islands, it's fascinating. There's a whole, I don't know, it's like this like a Hollywood movie, there are things you cannot say. And if you are known to be somebody that said something in favor of Argentina or in favor of some historical fact that brings objectivity and truth and includes Argentina in some kind of righteous argument about the dispute, it will take hours before the whole of the Islander population has identified you as whatever, as against, as an enemy, as somebody that should not be there, and you get kicked out, and maybe you get something burnt, or somebody gets killed, or something. These things actually happen. Nobody wants to talk about that. And it serves Britain very well, because it's like saying, we made sure they got angry against the Argentinians, so now we can look like the good guys that yield to their wishes. And so this referendum was produced right when at the height of resentment, because of course the Argentinians don't have tact. The junta didn't have tact. They were really stupid. They didn't see this coming. But the soldiers, of course, they went there and they acted like the place was theirs, and they filled Stanley very undelicately. You know, they looked at the islanders like freaks from another world or what have you, and so of course, as soon as the war was over, there was a repressed flurry of scorn for having been invaded, for feeling invaded. And it is not a ridiculous argument to say that there's enough intelligence in British society and British government, in the military, in the British military, to forecast and use this, plan on such repercussions that will follow a war. And that these ideas, these notions, these understandings are communicated to the Prime Minister, to the rulers of the land, to say this is what will happen. We will win the war, and then the islanders will hate the Argentinians, and it will be a lot easier for us to do this, and that, because no longer will they naturally allow themselves to gravitate, like I was describing before, to the mainland. We absolutely need a war, actually. It's God sent. And if Margaret Thatcher was told this, of course she would scare away anybody that dared talk about negotiations or treating the situation with fairness and objectivity, because that would go against their perfect plan to let this war happen so that we can change the paradigm, completely change the narrative, completely change the situation. And and of course then they can go to NATO, they can go to Belgium and say, or Washington or wherever, and say, well, this is what, we got a huge chance here to establish a big military base in the South Atlantic in the face of China, growing China, expansion of China, what have you. And so it's a military move. It has always been, the Falklands has always been a military move for the British and now for NATO. Well, for the Argentinians, it's always been a human, civil, historical, heartfelt matter to do with the integrity of their nation and the integrity of their history and the justice for what was committed against them in the past. The British have always been antagonistic. Another thing that you won't hear much talk about in English language, they tried to invade Argentina before it was a nation. They invaded while it was a nation. They tried to take over the rivers, navigation rights, and try to split the country. And it's always been interventionism. They created Uruguay, and they wanted Uruguay and Brazil and Argentina to fight against Paraguay, and they supported the war of Chile, and they sided with Chile against Argentina, against Peru, against Bolivia. The British have always been. Is it any wonder these countries can't pick up and just find their own center and walk confidently? That whole mess just keeps getting worse. But at least let's talk about things as they really are, and stop lying to ourselves, and stop trying to win. Stop trying to use medias and news and social networks to convince others of things. That's what an ideology is, basically. Ideologies. We have a world that is fighting to be built through ideology. What is an ideology? An ideology is an idea that you presume, or you expect, or you believe that is ideal or better for all to live or others to live by. It's a presumption of the behavior of others. So a political principle or political ideology is basically people saying, we believe everybody should live by this. And there's a problem with this. There's a problem with this. Is that each one of us, even though that we're first an organic collective, and we can only understand each individual, and we can only understand the human species and each individual by first understanding as a starting point of logic and comprehension an organic collective species, an organism, collective organism. And then we can understand the human species and the nuances and ultimately how each individual may act different to another individual. So the paradigm of both collective and individual is one. We are mistaken in thinking that we must build political ideology on individualism, and it is why the other half of the human brain acts up and says unfair, justice, we're forgetting these people, and we're hogging all the power over there, and we're putting these masses to shame over there. And so the collective half of the brain rises up, and so here we are in this teeter-totter that we afflict ourselves by not acknowledging the integrity of a single brain and the paradigm that is each one of us and all of the human organism as collective and individualism in a single intelligent expression. And so what happens is that when we think we must impose or we expect an idealism or ideology to others, we run into the force of the individual, which should not be alone or first, which exists for the integrity of the collective, but nonetheless, we provoke it to act up and fight because we're telling it what to do. Simply put, nobody likes to be told what to do. There's a natural evolutionary and understanding of that notion, why nobody likes to be told what to do. And yet there's another part of us that kind of wants to see what everybody else is doing so that we can do the same and have the same and do everything together. But we don't want people to tell us what to do. That's a paradox or paradigm, the totality of which describes a single mind. So we need to understand the human species as a paradox or simultaneous forces that happen at once as one expression of human intelligence, collective and individualism. And so ideologies tend to always run into creating problems because they fail. But that's a whole other argument. I really didn't intend to go into that. I hope you enjoyed my little monologue, my little excessively long monologue. And I'm gonna make myself something to eat. Ciao tutti.